Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Sorry, I'm just working on my latest office hours here. This week's is about pop and polish, and pop and polish are part and parcel of making any game experience engaging. What do I mean by pop and polish? Well, in this case, we're going to talk about things like animations, particle effects, camera transitions, other simple things like that that can add a lot of flavor to your game. So without any further ado, let's step outside and see what we've got. Tip number 1 is give a little bit of thought to the theming of your game. So we've got some folks who are excellent at this in CIP, such as Infernal Viper 11, Lambda, Scooter D, and others, who just make these exquisite environments that are super cohesive. But it doesn't take a ton of time or effort to make something that feels nice. So for example, for this office hours, we've got this little rainy scene with some fog, and this was very simple to set up. So I'll show you quickly how all of that works. So if I go and grab my rain effects entity, you'll see that it's this stretched bounding box here. And you can see the rain particles falling, right? And the way that this works is actually incredibly simple. So I just have a particle effect where I've fiddled with the values to make them nice. And then to stretch the particles into these raindrops, what I've done is I've turned off face camera here. See, if they're facing the camera, they're always kept square billboards. But if you turn it off, then the transform of the entity will actually affect the particles, which is how we have these stretched out raindrops. And then to make them feel nice physically, all I've done is I've fiddled with them to I've put a heavy drag, because raindrops are small and they experience a lot of air drag. And so they fall kind of slowly, they reach their terminal velocity pretty quickly, and so it's like a light rain. And as for the sound of the rain, let me see. I just stuck the sound on one of these entities. I don't remember which one. Let's see. The house has... Okay, so there's some wind chimes in the background when you're near the building. And then this birch tree is just projecting the rain at a constant volume, a low volume, and it's the waterfall sound effect. But it gets the job done. It feels pretty nice, I think. Another tip that I learned from Voxelius is the fog and the sky color blend together. The default render settings, whenever something is in the distance, it kind of becomes lighter than the sky usually, and it looks kind of weird and unrealistic. So just a simple tip for that is you want to make your sky gradient and your fog match up cleanly together. So if we open the renderer, fog, background, gradient, and we take a look, I've put the same color for the fog as the bottom 60% of the sky gradient, so that things fade away, and they actually fade away when they fade away. So that's another little tip. Tip number 2 is you want to draw the player's attention to things that are important for them. So as video games have gotten more complex, environments tend to be more and more detailed. So it becomes a challenge to figure out how to let the player know that something is interactable or important when the level of detail on everything is similar, right? It would feel really weird if you were playing, like, I don't know, a hyper-realistic modern shooter or something, and there's a gun on the ground and it's like deforming and flashing gold and like has all these particle effects and stuff. It would feel weird. So usually those games have very tightly obeyed conventions to let you know what you can interact with. And how you can integrate this into your own games varies by what the game is like. It doesn't have to be complex necessarily. So our first example is Pac-Man. So what's great about Pac-Man is everything that's important is colored a lot more brightly and has more contrast than the background. So all of the walls and floors have more muted colors, Each ghost has a bright, unique color. Pac-Man has a bright, unique color. All of the pellets and pills are way brighter than everything else. And the fruits are also like high contrast sprites, right? So whenever anything shows up or moves on the screen, you can immediately track it because each important thing is unique and brightly colored so it stands out from the background. In more modern games, this can get really subtle, actually. So I have a screenshot here from The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. From that game onward, every 3D Zelda uses this convention, which is if there's anything that Link can interact with or that he should worry about or that might be relevant to the player, Link will look at it, which is actually really cool. So in Wind Waker, there's not really a nag character like Navi or Fi. You have basically a pager in your pocket that goes off occasionally when the game designers really think you need a hint or they have to do it for like a plot device or something. But most of the time, you just get to wander around in this world and chart your own course. But if you get stuck and you let Link idle for a little while, he'll start looking at things, and he'll look at things that he can interact with. And it's a way to kind of provide a little hint to the player without breaking the fourth wall at all. Because, Link's just a random, like, tweenage kid. He's going to be looking at things that are interesting to him, and those happen to be the things that are important for you as the player. So there's a wide range of how to communicate what information is important and what information isn't. I didn't pull up a screenshot for this, but another example is power-ups in most games tend to be very visually distinct. Most games that have power-ups per se are a little more arcadey and a little more video gamey. So, question blocks and Mario Kart are these like holograms that are floating and spinning and stuff. And that's fine because it's not like, it's not Horizon Zero Dawn where that would feel out of place, right? Things like that. I use too many filler words. Something else, so with that, animation is another big one for drawing the player's attention to things that matter. Generally, visual signals are going to be the bulk of what you want to do to draw people's attention, just because it's the easiest to do and it's the convention. Some games also have audio cues, like whenever you're within a certain range of a specific, like maybe a checkpoint or something, it'll emit some sound that's spatialized, right? So in some games, a common convention nowadays for 3D open world games is there are radio towers or things that are dressed up radio towers and you have to climb to the top, and when you climb to the top, it fills in a big chunk of your map, right? And so in some games, things like that would emit like little tinkly sounds or like a low hum or something. So even if you're not looking at a mini-map or you don't even have a mini-map, you can kind of feel your way around to the thing that you're trying to reach. And it still feels cohesive in the game world. It's not like there's a big marker on the HUD that's like, walk here to play game. And I mean, some games are made to be that way, walk here to play game, and it's fine. It just depends on what kind of game design you're trying to build, what you want the game to be like. It's entirely up to you. Next, I would like to talk briefly about the 12 principles of animation. Not all of these are going to be super relevant, and a bunch of them overlap with each other, but I think it's useful to talk about because animation is extremely important for visual media. Animation essentially is a way of iconifying real-world phenomena, which is a hoity-toity thing to say, but you'll get what I mean in a second. So let's look at these. So squash and stretch is just conservation of mass amplified. So have you ever watched like a high-speed video of a golf ball bouncing off a hard surface? When you think of a golf ball, you think of it as pretty solid and you can't really squish it in your hand, but you can tell that it feels a little bit springy, and of course it will bounce if you throw it on the ground. But if you use a high-speed camera and watch a golf ball hit something moving pretty quickly, the golf ball actually deforms a lot. Like the golf ball really squishes. And of course, when you squish something, like if you take an orange in your hand and you squish it, as it gets smaller on one axis, it has to bulge out on the other two because its mass is conserved and that the rest of the orange has to go somewhere, right? So squash and stretch is that exaggerated. So in a cartoon, like if a character is going to jump, they squat down really low and they really spread out. And then when they jump, they get really tall and skinny before they actually leave the ground. And that cartooniness actually makes it easier for your brain to follow than if it was perfectly realistic. If the animation was perfectly realistic, it would actually be a lot less engaging to watch, and your brain would not follow it as well. Because animation, no matter how high your FPS is, animation is lower FPS than real life. And so having squash and stretch and doing what's called smears or wipes, which is in between frames where the character's really, really exaggerated, help your brain fill in the gaps between the frames with something that feels plausible, even though it's less realistic, if that makes sense. So squash and stretch comes up a lot, and it's a way that you can make something feel more lively. And ironically, with squash and stretch, you're deforming the object, but deforming the object makes it seem more physical. Like it takes up space because you can see the conservation of mass happening. It makes it feel more like the object is taking up space than if it was a realistic depiction of like, well, this is a barrel or a crate or something. It's not squashy, right? But making it a little bit squashy actually looks better most of the time, unless you're making something hyper realistic. I should have pulled up a slow motion video of McCree from Overwatch. Whenever he does his special move or whatever, he kind of like whips his arm with his pistol towards the camera. And it's actually some really good animation. That game has a kind of semi-realistic cartoony style. And if you really slow down that animation, McCree's arm just becomes this huge arcing spaghetti noodle for a couple frames, and then snaps straight. And it feels infinitely better because they did that. Like if it was just a perfectly realistic human arm just swinging around, it wouldn't feel as snappy or as fluid as it does. And that's kind of the key thing. Next, we've got anticipation. So what anticipating action is before the main action takes place, you get ready for it, right? So this is in like classic Looney Tunes. If a character is going to punch another character, they do this crazy wind up, right? And like you can kind of feel the whole mass of their body going back into this fist. And then when they swing it forward, you feel all of this momentum, right? It's as if you were holding a barbell and swinging it, right? And so another example of anticipating action would be like if you're going to jump, you squat down first, right? Having those things present is a huge deal. It makes a humongous difference. And it's not that hard to program generally or to animate, but it pays massive dividends. And kind of all the things I'm going to talk about today aren't that hard to do, but they pay large dividends. So they're a good time investment for what they cost. Staging, we kind of talked about theming a little bit. Staging is more like building a shot, which most of the games aren't super cinematic right now. You can kind of get a little bit cinematic. So for example, when I walked into my dev shack here, there's a camera transition, the camera pulls in closer and it centers on the character. When I walk back outside, it zooms out so you can see that you're in this wide open space, and it moves a little bit to one side because I'm going to be looking at things to the side of my character in the office hours. But things like that, like little teeny tiny bits of cinematography, make a huge difference. So when I'm in here, because the camera pulls in closer, it feels cozier in this little shack. If the camera was still far away, it would feel cramped, actually. But having the camera closer puts you more in the character's like frame of view of the scene. And so it allows you to kind of put yourself in their shoes more. And you're like, I'm in my cozy little shack with my coffee and my laptop and whatever. Other elements of staging is like little environmental things. So like I have a little notebook and I have a little pencil and I have some sticky notes and a pot plant and like all these things. And so you could even make this scene with all these same items, but if they were all just rotated, right, perfectly aligned with each other, it wouldn't feel natural. It would feel like Lego or something. But everything is rotated slightly the way it would be in real life, right? If you're sitting at a desk and you have a notebook, it's going to be angled towards you generally. And if you have a pen or something on the notebook, the pen is going to be angled like on the corner so that it doesn't roll off, right? Little things like that. When you're designing a space, think about that sort of thing, and it will make your environments feel a lot more natural, even if it's, even if you're making a game out of big chunky voxels in a cartoony style, right? So that's something to think about. What's next? So pose-to-pose action and straight-ahead action, we can more or less ignore for now. Those are techniques for animating. And they do apply when you're making like voxel animations, but they're not super relevant to this office hours, so I'm going to skip over them. Follow-through action goes with anticipation. The order of these, I dispute. Like the order that these typically are in, I dispute. Follow-through action and anticipation go together. So when you're squatting down before your jump, that's anticipation. Follow-through is when you actually jump up. And so you go past, follow-through is you go past the target a little bit and then come back to it, right? So like if you're going to punch something, you're punching through the thing, right? Like that's what you're attempting to do, is you're attempting to punch past the thing that you're punching, and then afterwards your arm withdraws somewhat before you actually like withdraw it, right? Or if you're swinging a door open, typically, if you're in a hurry at least, the door will go woo and it'll hit the door jamb, right? The little, or no, that's not what it's called, the little shock absorber doohickey where if you flip it, it goes like that thing. The door will hit that and then it'll come back to rest a little bit closer, right? So that's follow through, is you go all the way through the motion and a little bit farther and then come back. Because what that does is it shows that the momentum is being carried by the mass that's moving. And then whenever it comes to rest, it settles back into a more natural position. Think of it like a spring. If you take a spring and you stretch it out and you let go, it wobbles. And then when it comes to rest, like when it's wobbling, it'll stretch back out some, which is not natural to the spring. Well, I mean, it is natural to the spring, but it's not at rest. When it comes to rest, it'll eventually be shorter, right? Overlapping action is when you have multiple things happening at once. You don't want them to just be, you don't want all of your animated elements to be in goose step with each other. You want them to be offset by little bits because it feels more natural and it looks a lot better. So like, what's a good example? If you had a bunch of pendulums swinging and all of them were on the exact same rhythm, it would feel kind of weird because usually in real life that doesn't happen. what you would generally prefer to have instead is each one is offset a little bit. Like if you're going through the tomb corridor and there's swinging axes, if all the axes are lined up with each other, it's really boring, right? And it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what you will typically see is each successive axe down the corridor will be a little bit later, right? And so you get this kind of snaky, wavy thing happening, and that's what you want. Slow in and slow out is what whoever wrote these originally put. That just means easing. So if you're not familiar with easing, what that means is if I have this pen, it's not visible on the camera. If I have this can of soda, which is getting blurred out too, if I wanted to move this can of soda from this spot to this spot, I could move it a constant amount every second, right? And that would be incredibly unrealistic, because what actually happens when I'm doing this motion is I'm deciding where I want the can to go, and then I'm accelerating my arm in that direction, and then when I get near the target, I start to decelerate my arm so that I stop on target, right? So there's never a constant speed unless you really think about it. It's not natural for anything, any living thing that's moving to have a constant speed. It would be more like this. And this has easing. So it moves slower at the beginning of the motion, faster in the middle, and then slower again at the end. So that's what slow in and slow out means. Arcs, number 9, is kind of obvious, but I guess for beginning animators, maybe it isn't. Generally speaking, things don't move in straight lines either. Things move in arcs. All of your limbs are on joints, and they can move in a radius around the joint. So every motion you ever make, unless you get to every motion you ever make more or less is going to be an arc involuntarily. Pretty much any living thing that moves will be moving in an arc, and even things that don't necessarily move voluntarily or fast, like plants, they're anchored to one point, and so their movements are in an arc. So our brains are programmed to expect things to move in arcs. Everything in real life moves in arcs. And so whenever things move in a perfectly straight line, it feels very computery. So just be aware of that. Secondary action, I don't have an example of, but what this is, I didn't make an example of, rather, but I can tell you an example. Actually, I could tell you a lot of examples, but I'm going to tell you a specific example. If you've played Super Mario Odyssey on Nintendo Switch, Mario's nose has secondary action, and what that means is they want to show you that his nose has mass, and the way they do that is whenever Mario's head moves, his nose trails a little bit behind his head, and then whenever his head stops, his nose follows through a little bit farther and then comes back to rest, like a spring. So whenever Mario's jogging, his nose is bouncing up and down, and it's on an offset from his run cycle, and his nose jiggles a little bit. It's a way to give secondary action, is a way to give things extra weight, and it makes things feel less rigid on a character, and it can also accentuate things. So like in a UI, for example, maybe you hover over a button and it scales up a little bit or something. And then maybe whenever you click it, it shrinks again, but then there's also something else. Like maybe it kind of settles back into place. Maybe there's like a shine that goes across it, something extra. Timing, I don't know why timing is just timing. I don't know. And exaggeration is pretty much all of these things involve some exaggeration, but it's very important, so they give it its own bullet point. Like I said before, where we're doing something frame by frame, the way to make it feel natural and to get your brain to paper over the gaps between the frames is to exaggerate motion, to exaggerate conservation of mass, things like that. And it makes things feel a lot more lively than they otherwise would. But having talked about this, we can move on to some actual examples. So as an example of the animation principles that we just talked about, I wanted to show you guys this GIF of The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap for Game Boy Advance, because the Game Boy Advance is like, resolution is like 240 by 160, and it doesn't matter because you can still apply all of the same techniques you would drawing animations on cells or making a 3D character or whatever. So I wish I could scrub. So here Eslo starts chanting, Eslo's the hat, and he starts jumping up and down on Link's head. And what you'll notice is, as he's jumping up and down on Link's head, Link is kind of like doing this on an offset, which implies that Eslo's kind of heavy and burdensome. And this is actually important. So this tiny detail is actually a perfect illustration of the relationship that Link and Eslo have, especially at this early point in the game. This is the first time you see this animation in the game. You met Eslo 5 minutes ago, and he's this crotchety old man, and he's like, oh great, some dumb kid. And maybe yesterday your best friend was turned to stone, and you've been tasked with fixing that, even though you're a child, because unfortunately only a child can do what needs to be done. So Link is in this very difficult position for a kid who's maybe 11. And you meet this crotchety, cranky hat and save him from some monsters, and now you're kind of unwillingly, at this time, helping each other. And him bouncing on Link's head and Link kind of like wincing is because he's a little bit burdensome, and by the end of the game they will have developed a much closer friendship, etc. But it's just this little tiny touch in the animation, but even if you don't notice it consciously, it contributes to Eslo's characterization, and like it contributes to the relationship that Link and Eslo have. And it's just this teeny tiny thing. So like, you really don't, like, it doesn't take a lot of effort to do something like that, but it adds a lot, and it makes, like, those little touches are what make games like this really cohesive and good at storytelling. Even if the stories that they're telling are pretty simple most of the time, these little things add a lot. So other stuff that you'll notice is whenever they shrink, there's squash and stretch, and there's anticipating action, and there's follow through. So Link kind of gets shorter and stretches out wide, and then he gets skinny. His feet stay planted to the ground, but he gets tall and skinny, and then after he gets tall and skinny, then his feet leave the ground and catch up with him, and he gets tiny, right? And it's very cartoony, and it feels great because it has this anticipating action, it has the follow through, it has the secondary action, which is his feet leaving the ground after the rest of his body. And of course the squash and stretch is the main attraction. It's just really good stuff. And this is on a screen that's like 2.5 inches wide or something, and they did it anyway because it's really important. And I just wanted to show this example because it's so good. All right, I've kept you guys waiting long enough, so time for some actual examples. So this has the caption, easing applied to scalar quantities, which is a complicated way of saying that all of these doors use easing for one number. So I want to emphasize how easy it is to add this kind of flair with easing. So we have one number, which is the door's rotation around Y, right? And we could just move it a set amount every frame like I talked about before, and that looks like this, which is just super boring. It's fine, right? The door opens and you can walk through it, but it doesn't feel very realistic, right? The door does move in an arc because it's on hinges, but doors don't move like this. Whenever you move a door, usually it swings on the hinges. It doesn't move at a set rate unless you're like in a hospital wing and the door opens on its own. But even then, it's usually kind of like whoop, and it kind of like, it swings a little, it follows through. It goes farther than it needs to go, and then it comes back and stops, right? So we've got some different examples of different kinds of easing, which we'll cover those in a minute. I'll just show you an example. So for follow through, we have back easing. What back easing does is it goes a little bit past the target and then comes back, which a lot of things move like that in real life. So I'll just show you how it looks. So it swings open a little farther than it needs to, and it swings closed a little farther than it needs to, and then it comes back. Now, that is very simple, but it makes the door feel a lot more like a door. And which easing you use can change the feel of the thing that you're animating. So for example, elastic looks more like this. It wiggles around the target as if the door is on a spring at each position, right? And there's several others that I'll cover in a second. So I want to show you guys how dead simple this is to do. Now this is not the script in use, because the script in use on those doors has an implementation for all of the different easing functions, right? But here is DBB door, which I wrote after I posted a GIF of these, and somebody was like, oh man, I need a door. So here's our script. It's 55 lines of code. So what it does is, on start, it saves the Y rotation of the door as the closed position, and then whenever it's ticking, so we have a timer where we're just counting the time every frame, and then what we want to do is we have some animation length, which is how long it takes the door to open or close. Now in this case it's just 1 second, but it could be whatever you want. But here it's 1 second. And so what we do is we get our timer value, we divide it by the length of the animation, and then we map that on a range from 0 to 1. So this 0 to 1 is the fraction of the animation that we've gone through, right? And we call that t. And so if the t value has changed, then we need to animate the door. And so what we do is, if the door is open, then we apply easing to t. Now these easing functions are ubiquitous. I've seen implementations of them in 7 or 8 programming languages. I don't know who the original author is. I don't know, but they're very common. Our implementation is from tween.js, which is a nice little JavaScript library that provides sort of the standard easing functions that everybody uses. And so there's different kinds. So you've got the easing namespace, and then under that you have all these different kinds of easing, and then for each one you can ease in, you can ease out, and you can ease in and out. Now what that means is, when you ease out, that means that when the animation starts, it's at full speed, and then when it gets toward the end, it slows down. When you ease in, you start at 0 and then speed up throughout the animation. And when you're easing in and out, you start at 0, speed up through the middle, and then slow down towards the end, which is how things tend to work in real life, right? When you're driving your car, you start it from 0, you accelerate to the speed limit, and then whenever you get to your destination, you slow to a stop, right? So easing in and out is how things tend to work, but that's not necessarily what you always want for animation purposes. So looking back at our examples here, so all of these doors, they only ease out, well, except this one, and I'll show you that one in a minute. So it starts out at full speed and then slows down at the end, starts out at full speed, slows down at the end, etc. That's kind of desirable for a door, because when your player is walking through a door, they want it to open fast. They don't want to have to wait. So you can either have a shorter animation and ease in and out, or you can have a little bit of a longer animation as long as the door is mostly open pretty quickly, right? Because I can just walk through here while the animation hasn't even finished yet, and it's fine, because a lot of the animation is cosmetic toward the end, right? But the door opens quickly. Anyway, so I lost my train of thought. Anyhow, so when the doors open, we apply easing to our value. So remember, t is between 0 and 1. And the way that these easing functions work is really convenient. You just give them a value between 0 and 1, and then they remap it to whatever the eased position would be on 0 to 1. So t is a linear progression from 0 to 1, a constant amount every frame, but we ease it, and that makes it a more interesting curve. So over here I have, where is it? Tween.js provides this nice little page where they graph all of the different ease functions for you. So on the left side is 0, and on the right side is 1, and these graphs represent the values that you get back out. So linear is no easing, right? Which is what we're already doing by counting the time. Quadratic is a gentle curve, and then you go from, you've got quadratic, cubic, quartic, and quintic, which are just higher and higher order exponential functions, and those are cheap to do because it's all multiplies, right? Not that that super matters most of the time. But then you've got circular, you've got elastic, which you can see the elastic door wobbles. You can see the wobble here in the graphs, right? And you can see how it changes with easing in, easing out, and both. So this is a really cool illustration. And when the office hours is posted, I'll include links to all of the things that I've referred to in it. But you can see all of these here and see how they work. But so all we do, we take our t value, we ease it, so it's between 0 and 1, we ease it, the number we get back is still between 0 and 1. And so because we have the number is just a fraction of how far we are through the animation, we can just multiply that by whatever quantity we need to manipulate, right? So in this case, we want to get the yaw, which is the y rotation of the door. So what we do is we interpolate, which basically what lerp does, if you don't know, is lerp will take a minimum value and a maximum value and a fraction of how far you want to go between them, and it will give you back that number. So if I have 0 and 10 and I give it 0.5, it will give me 5, because 5 is halfway between 0 and 10, right? Makes sense. So all we're doing is we are going to lerp, which is linear interpolation, which is what we're doing by counting time, right? Is we're linearly interpolating from 0 to animation length. We're going to lerp from the start yaw, which is where the door was rotated when the animation started, and we're going to linearly interpolate from that value to whatever the closed yaw plus the open offset is. So in this case, the open offset is 90 degrees from the closed value. The door opens 90 degrees. But then I think the doors on the shack open a little bit farther than that, for example. So what we do, so we take that value, which is in degrees, we convert it to radians by dividing by 180 and then multiplying by pi. And then for the fraction between this value and this value, we provide t, which is on the range from 0 to 1. And so then we get an interpolated value, which is t amount between the two values. And then we just set the y rotation of the door to that quantity. I'm super over explaining this probably for almost all of you, but I want to really drive home how simple this is. Like this is not a lot of code. This is very little code, and it's really easy to write. So you can do this stuff, and it doesn't have to be hard. You don't have to simulate physics for your game's doors. You can just move it from one value to another value and slap some easing on it, and it behaves a lot more like a real door than it has any right to for doing something so cheap and easy, right? But so that's how that works. And then if the door is closed, we apply different easing in this door script. So the way this one works is when the door is opening, it opens fast and wobbles, and when it's closing, it follows through, so it swings out a little bit and then back into closed. And then all this is just we grab the player entity, we check if they're within the radius where the door should open, and then if it's not open, like if it's not open and it should be, or it is open and it shouldn't be, then we change the state of the door to be the new state, open or closed. We reset our timer, and then we say where we were at the start of the animation. And this is important because a common mistake that people make with writing little animations like this is they will assume that the door will be fully closed before it needs to open, or fully open before it needs to close. And that's not necessarily the case, because somebody could start to walk up to the door and then walk away. And even when that happens, you want it to still animate cleanly from wherever it was, not where it would eventually be. So pro tip, whenever you're starting an animation like this that you've programmed, always record where the animation is actually starting and not where theoretically it should be starting. But anyway, so that's how the doors work. So I showed you guys the graphs of all the easing functions from tween.js. This is what those graphs look like as linear motion. So each of these blocks has one of the particular easing functions applied. The ones on the top showcase easing in, so they start slow, end fast. The second tier is ease out, so they start fast and slow. And then the bottom ones ease in and out. So you can see how interesting some of these movements are, and they're basically free to compute. Like, I mean, compared to almost anything else in a video game, they are functionally free. You're doing some multiplies, and that's it. And it's trivial to write the code as well. So the elastic one is a favorite because it wiggles in and then it wiggles back out. It's very energetic looking, for example. Circular is very smooth. And then these are out of order. It should be linear, quadratic, cubic, quartic, quintic, because those are all just exponential functions, but each one is steeper than the last. So quintic has a really steep curve, and quadratic has a much gentler curve. But you can play with them and find which one you want for a different thing. Bounce in and out is kind of awkward. I've never seen it used, I don't think. But bounce out and bounce in both work. So you can see how they behave. So sometimes you might want to have some animation that seems a little bit like there's some gravity, but you don't want to bother with the gravity or collision, and you can just use bounce easing if you know how far you need to go to get to the ground, because you've programmed it that way. You can just use bounce easing and not do any real work at all. Pro tips. Back easing is another favorite. So with easing in and out with back easing, as you can see, what it does is great because it has this anticipating action where it kind of rears back and then it goes past the target and then settles back into it. It's a lot like if you're going to do a sprint, you kind of lean back on your foot and then you burst forward, and then when you stop, you usually go a little bit past where you wanted to go and kind of lean forward and then back to where you meant to stop, right? So some of these feel very natural, and they're the kind of movements that you see in real life. So it feels good to put them in a video game because it adds a lot of liveliness to things in the game, and it makes them feel just plain better. I know I keep repeating myself on that, but it's true. So now that we've looked at these, let's look at the rest of our door animations here. So again, we've got the boring linear, and then we've got exponential out, which is just a smooth curve out and back in. no frills. So if you're making kind of a serious game with not a lot of whimsy, might be good. Exponential in-out I actually particularly like for sort of serious game doors, because it starts out slow and then very rapidly opens and then slowly stops. So it gets out of your way quickly, but you can kind of feel the weight of the door. Back we've already shown, elastic we've already shown. Bounce is interesting. So it doesn't really make sense to have it bounce both ways, but you could have a door that swings open and then falls back closed, right? And it looks really good for that. Next, we're going to talk about adding some oomph to things like power-ups. So we were talking before about adding visual interest to things that you can interact with in the game to differentiate them from background elements, especially in visually rich games, like if you have a lot of details like trees and other stuff. Of course, so we've utilized color, so these are much brighter than the surrounding stuff, and you can tell that they're not part of the background because they have some motion, they're floating, etc. But we're going to go through each of these, and sort of each stage of this is going to add a little bit more flair that has different effects on the mood of the object. And we're going to do that right after I take my tater tots out of the oven. Alright, let's talk about these little power-ups that we've got over here. So, this is the most basic thing you can do, right? It's got a bright color that sets it apart from the background, and we've got it floating in the air to show you that it's not a piece of decoration. So most of you are probably familiar with sine curves, and this little guy is just moving up and down on a sine curve. And we'll talk briefly about sine curves just in case people are unfamiliar and don't know how to manipulate them. Sine curves are actually super useful because they're fairly cheap on modern hardware, and they can nicely animate a lot of things for you. So sine curves fit into something called periodic motion, and that describes things like waves and pendulum swings and orbits. Things like that are periodic. It's a relatively stable path of some kind that the object is taking, and it's stable in space as well as time. So one full motion takes the same amount of time, called the period, and 1 over the period, the reciprocal of the period, is called the frequency, which is how many times it does the thing per second. So if we just graph a sine curve, it looks like this. Most of you are probably familiar with this. And so on this graph, you can consider the x-axis to be time. So over time, we waggle up and down in a smooth motion. And since we're not multiplying x by pi or anything, what that means is from here to here is 2 pi, and from here to here is also 2 pi, which you can look at 6.28 whatever, right? And so here where it crosses the x-axis is 3.14159, etc., 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 etc. And these are useful because sine curves give us a number in a range from -1 to +1, which we can then trivially remap onto whatever we want. So if you want an object that bobs up and down, you can take its base y position, and then you can take that -1 to +1, multiply it by how far up and down you want the object to move, and then apply it to that base position every frame, and you get a motion like this. So if we go and we look in this DBB sine script, we've got the amplitude, the period, and the initial position, and the time. And so all we do is every tick we go, and this is me checking if the properties have been changed, kind of hacky. But if we've got valid values, then we take the time and we modulus it by the period. That isn't strictly necessary because since the motion is periodic, as time passes, the object's going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? But doing the modulus of the period gets us, and this just means remainder if anybody doesn't know that. So we're dividing the timer by the period of the motion and keeping the remainder. What that does is it gives us how far we are through the present motion. So it doesn't matter how many times we've moved up and down before, we want to know how far we are through the current move up and down, right? And that's what this gives us. And so then what we do is we divide how far we are by the period. So how far are we through this curve? And we map that onto 0 to 1. And then we multiply it by 2 pi, because if we come back over here, 2 pi is one full cycle where we go up and then down and then back to the middle. That's 2 pi. So the way you can think about this, if you've never done any trig stuff, is if you had, this can has soda in it, if you had a wheel, like a flat wheel, and it was rolling through time, if you pick a point on the outside of that wheel, that point will trace this curve. So like if you had the wheel rolling across the x-axis, any point you picked on that wheel would be drawing this sine wave as the wheel rolled. And if your wheel has a radius of 1, then its circumference, 2 pi r, is just 2 pi, right? So 2 pi is just one full rotation on a 2D plane. 3D is different, but we're not talking about that. I'm going to leave Ashley to do it because she's going to talk about quaternions anyway. So anyway, point being, so this K here, that is the theta, that's the angle, that's how much rotation, right, around that unit circle. And then here we get an offset from the base position. So wherever the apple started, we want to add that to whatever our result is. So we take that base position, and then what we do is we get the, I'm using cosine here, not sine. That'll be because, I'll show you why that is. So the reason I'm using cosine there instead of sine is because cosine starts at the top without any offset. You'll notice that cosine is just sine offset a little bit. So offset by like a quarter. Anyway, so we're taking the amplitude. The amplitude is how tall the waves are from the trough to the crest. So it's from down here to up here. That's the amplitude. So we're taking that, and why is this one divided by 2 and this one's times a half? That's silly. Same thing. So what we're doing is because sine gives us a number between -1 and +1, we're just remapping that onto 0 to 1, I think. Not exactly. Anyway, point being, nice little sine wave. So you can think of this as the apple is like, let's say the apple's floating in water. As the wave passes under it, it lifts it up, and then as the wave passes away, it drops back down. That's all that is. So let's talk about sine waves for a second. So if we just do sine of x, where x is time, we get this situation where around 6.28 seconds, we make one full revolution around the unit circle, we make one full wave, right? What you would typically do here is multiply time by pi, which means that each second is half of a circle and 2 seconds is the whole circle, right? And you'll notice whenever we multiplied our variable by something, when we added a coefficient, it changed the horizontal scale of the waves, right? So we have increased the frequency by doing that. So if this was an animated thing bobbing up and down, now it would go faster. It would go 3.1415. It would go pi times faster is what it would go. Anyway, let's put that back down where it was. So if we multiply things inside there, it raises the frequency. And if we add things, if we multiply the end result by something, what that's going to do is stretch the graph vertically. So let's say we did sine of x multiplied by 1.5. You can see that it's gotten taller. So whenever we multiply by the amplitude of how high the apple should move, this is what we're doing. We're stretching the waves vertically. So after this, you can also offset things. So let's say instead of x times something, we added something to this calculation. So we can say, okay, well, I want to add half of a pi to x. What that'll do is it'll shift the curve over. Turn this off. It shifts the curve over, and now it's the cosine curve, right? Because we've shifted it over half a pi, we've shifted it 90 degrees, basically, around that rolling circle. And you can combine these things, right? So anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about that. But so we've added a little bit of flair to this by having it wiggle up and down. And that does draw attention, but we can do more, so why not do more? So the next one, this one we've added an emissive effect, so it flashes a color. Nothing that fancy, but it draws a lot more attention. And the flashing is actually, I don't think it's linear. It looks like it's on a sine curve as well, the flashing. Similar to the easing, you're taking one value and transforming it into another single value, and then you can remap that value onto anything that you want to remap it onto, any range. So you can apply easing or any other function to anything you want. Yeah, so it's a cosine curve. So the reason the emissive fades so smoothly is because it's a cosine curve. If it was linear, it would not look half as nice. It would be like the door opening really awkwardly at a set speed, right? So what else can we do? So this one wobbles back and forth. So the different things you can do give different vibes to what you're making. So having the apple wobble back and forth and bob up and down makes it feel a little bit more, whimsical, to me anyway. It feels more whimsical, and it's more fun to look at and more interesting. It also more accurately looks like something that's bobbing up and down the way something might in water, at least to me. So what else can we do? Well, another trivial thing you can do is spin things. So this one spins and bobs up and down and wobbles. And it's gotten a lot more interesting, right? Now, the way I've done this for these examples is not particularly intelligent. I have stacked scripts on scripts I'm inside of the thing. I've got 4 scripts on here. If you're making, Crash Bandicoot, you don't want every Wumpa Fruit to have 4 scripts on it because that would be really slow because that game has a lot of Wumpa Fruit in it. You would probably want to make 1 script for your power-ups that does all of this work, right? But all of these things are just working on a timer and a sine curve. So it would be pretty trivial to combine these scripts into 1 script that did all the work. And here's the rocking motion script. I don't think there's anything particularly interesting in here. It's just another periodic motion script, except this one applies rotation on, I believe, the x-axis? No, the z-axis. So let's see. Next one. This one does all the previous stuff, but it also pulsates. And all we're doing here is we're adding a little bit to the scale based on a sine curve. Again, it's very simple, but it's effective. And what kind of effects you would want to put on things you can interact with depends on what the game feel is supposed to be like, what kind of environment the game has, what kind of item it is. So in a lot of games, things that are like points multipliers, like a big X2 or something, might pulsate like this, whereas some other power-up might not pulsate because it just doesn't, you want to add a different feel to different things, if that makes sense. So like, if you're playing a shooter, you're not going to go pick up some semi-automatic rifle and it's doing this stuff probably. Unless, I don't know, unless it's sort of a kid-oriented shooter like Splatoon or something. It would be weird if you were playing like Battlefield and any of the power-ups did this, right? So just keep in mind sort of what kind of feeling you're trying to convey. Now, this one is my favorite because it has squash and stretch. So what this one does, the scale pulsates, but it pulsates offset between horizontal scale and vertical scale. So by doing that, it shows the conservation of mass, right, doing the squash and stretch, and it feels, I don't know, fun. It feels fun. It's fun to look at. It's interesting to look at. It's spamming a bunch of transform updates, so I wouldn't want to put 300 of these in my game, but it looks pretty nice. And this one's supposed to be wobbling as well, but script execution, blah, blah, blah. There's like an ordering conflict in there. So let me see. If I turn spin off, it'll start wobbling. Yeah. And honestly, that looks pretty good without the spin anyway. But, so you can add different effects. And I'll show you quickly what the squash and stretch. So we've got a max scale multiplier, which is a coefficient applied to the starting scale. And then we've got the period, which is how long it takes it to do one wob wob. And then we've got, I called this delayed action, and this is just, so we could make it so that as the horizontal scale shrinks, the vertical scale immediately increases. What we've done instead is we've put a little bit of delay on it to give us overlapping action. So what that does is, when it's changing on one axis, there's a slight delay for when the other axis is at its peak and trough. So the sine curves that we were looking at, where this one is offset, this is what we've done between the X and Z scale and the Y scale. We've offset them from each other so that it's kind of like the scale on one axis is kind of lagging behind the other one, which isn't particularly realistic, but it looks nice and it feels nice to look at it. So that's that example. And then in this one, I've just plastered on some particle effects as like one more thing that could draw your attention, right? And this one has squash and stretch, and the spin works. Magic. So, next thing I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to give one more example of offsets with timers. So here we have this wave effect, and over here we have this kind of lazy, not really a ripple effect. And what's important to note about this is none of these cubes know about each other, and they don't need to know about each other. Each one of these cubes is moving up and down on a sine curve completely independently of the others. They don't know about each other, and they don't need to know about each other. Each cube just moves up and down, and they're moving at the same speed on the same sine curve, but we've offset the time for each of them. So, and we've done it based on their position. So what we've done is we add the X and Y of the cube together, and then we multiply that by like a 1/10 or something, and we use that as an offset to the timer. And so what that does is it creates this diagonal wave where each cube is just moving up and down, but it creates this effect in the aggregate. So often in your games you're not going to be doing this per se, but you might have something like, let's say you were going to make like a 3D platformer collect-a-thon like Banjo-Kazooie or Crash Bandicoot or any of those sorts of games where you're just picking up a bunch of stuff for 3 hours, right? If you have let's say you have 10 coins or 10 Wumpa fruits or 10 whatevers in a row, and you're going to go collect them, well, it would be really boring if all of them were moving up and down like this in a line, right? That would really, really be not interesting at all. It wouldn't look natural. But if you take the position of each power-up and then offset its timer based on its position, then whenever you have a line of pickups in a row, they'll move in a wave like this, right? Instead of moving up and down in a line like this. So my pro tip is to put timers and little animations on everything and then make sure that everything is offset a little bit from everything else. And it'll look great, usually, more or less for free. Moving swiftly on. Oh, so the offsets for this one are just, instead of offsetting by the position, just adding the X and Y together and multiplying them by a coefficient. In this one, the offset is based on the distance from the center, so you get this kind of circular, like, tablecloth looking thing. Anyway, so let's have a combined example. So this is a little animation that I made, which puts together a bunch of the things we've been talking about. So I'll show you the animation, and then we'll go and break down each of the pieces and how they fit together. So here's a chest, a treasure chest. I'm going to walk up to the treasure chest, and the lid flies off, and we get a bunch of coins, right? So now I'm going to pause. No, I won't. I'll just yoink over here, and we'll show you the pieces. So let's pause the game. Get our resources menu. I think everything in here. So there are 3 voxel objects involved in this. So there is, I don't remember what the original chest is called. Oops. Well, we can stop the game. So here is the open chest voxel model, and here's the lid voxel model. And then this is a third voxel model, which is just the closed original chest, and it's just called social chest. Voxelius made this presumably. So then we've got these 3 models that are involved. And if we look on here, what we find is a sound effect, which has nothing in it. Great. And we have this script, Office Hours 10.1.21 chest. And what this does is, so we have an effects template that we spawn when the chest opens. We have a lid template that we spawn when the chest opens, and then we have the voxel object that we're going to swap to when the chest opens. So currently the voxel model for this entity is the closed chest. We're going to swap it for the open chest, and then we're going to spawn a new entity to be the lid that animates itself. And so we have the activation radius, which is just how close the player needs to stand to activate it. And then we have open chest height, which is how many voxels tall the open chest model is, so that we can put the lid right on top where it belongs when we spawn it. So let's see. So we have several different states: closed, anticipation, opening, and opened. And we'll see what those do. So when we are ticking, if we're closed, then what we're going to do is check if the player is close enough to open. And if they are, we're going to go to the anticipation state. And can I change? Oh, I can. I can go change the animation length for this to be really long. And I'll show you what things look like. So the anticipation state is when the chest is squashing down, preparing to open, like it's preparing to jump, right? So it squashes down and it gets wider. And then whenever, oh, I covered up my own text, that's great. And then, well, I'll show you. So squash down, and then, whoop. So in the anticipation state, we go, so there are 2 phases to this. So we get, in the first half of the countdown, we scale our time. So basically, since it's in halves, we check if we're in the first half of the animation, and then we scale the time to just be from 0 to 1 on that half, right? And so then what we do is we expand the X and Z scale, and we shrink the Y scale. And then when we're on the second half of anticipating, then what we do is the name's not entirely accurate. The second half of anticipating is where we're coming back. So we've squashed down and now we're coming back up and getting skinnier, right, as we do so. And then, let's see. No, I misspoke. So I'm basically just doing exponential easing here. So I'm easing out and then I'm easing back in. And then what we do is if we're past the end of this phase of the animation, then we go to the opening state. And when we go to the opening state, we need to change our voxel object to the open chest, and then we need to spawn in the lid from the lid template. And if we do successfully spawn the lid, then we're going to put it where we need to put it so that it's on the chest, right? And then we're also going to spawn our effects if we have them. And so then on the next frame, we're in the opening state where we have this timer, and we basically just slowly return the chest back to its original scale is all we're doing there. And then whenever that animation is done, we go to the opened state and we're just opened forever. This chest doesn't like reset itself or anything. So that's how this script works. Now let's go look at all of the crazy templates involved in making everything else work. So here we have the lid template, and I'll just drop one down here. And if we start the game, whoosh, there it goes. So the lid template flies and does some flips. And we'll look at how that works. So there's a script for this, and it's a very short script. So we have a gravity constant, we have a start velocity, we have a Y velocity, and we have a vertical velocity, and then we also have a velocity on Z, because we don't want the chest lid to fly up and then land back on the chest. We want it to land behind the chest. So we just have a constant horizontal velocity. If you've ever done projectile motion in physics class or something like that, generally for simple projectile motion, kinematic motion, you ignore things like air resistance. So your horizontal velocity just stays the same, and your calculations are all based on the vertical velocity. So we have a timer, we have our start velocity on horizontal and vertical, and then we have our angular velocity, which is going to spin the lid, right? So every frame, we see how much time has passed. We accelerate downward, right? So we change our vertical velocity by gravity times delta time, and then we move the entity by its y velocity times delta time, and then we do the horizontal velocity. And then what I'm doing here with the angular velocity is I want the lid to spin fast when the chest opens, and then slow down and stop spinning as it flies through the air. So I'm applying drag in the laziest way possible to the angular velocity. And then I'm rotating by that, right? And I check for collisions. If I hit anything else, I stop. Now this is hacky. So if you put this chest inside of a room and the lid hit the roof, it would stick in it, for example. But for our purposes here, it's fine. So whenever the lid hits something, it just stops moving. And on the lid itself, we've set the collision to be a sphere because it's one of the shapes that works. And we've set it to be dynamic because we don't want the chest lid to get in the way of anything else. And making it dynamic means that other entities can push it. So we're going to do that. And then what else? So that's how that works. And you'll also notice it's on collision layer 4. I just did that because I didn't want, so I've had to compensate by putting things it needs to collide with on layer 7. But that's fine. And I did this because I wanted to be able to have the lid not collide with players or with the coins that come out of the chest. So that's how the lid works. And this is how the coin works. So there's one coin template that does this. So it starts with a random velocity, and it just throws itself, and it plays a little sound effect, and it spins and it fades out. So we've got the PlaySFX script. This is also a dynamic sphere, just because it's convenient. And then we have this chest coin script, where we have the start Y velocity, the gravity constant, the start angular velocity, which is large because we want it to spin quite fast. And then we have the angular drag, which affects how quickly it will slow down spinning. And then we have the lifetime, which is just how long it's going to exist before we delete it. And we're also going to use the lifetime to change the opacity so that it fades out over time. So it does this with all that stuff together. And so all we do in start, we set a random, we add a random offset to the position, so that we can spawn all these coins in the same place, and they'll move themselves around a little bit, so it's like they're not all spawning in the same place. And then when we're updating, if we're already dead, we just early out. If we're not, then we go and we add our velocities, we do our gravity, we do our angular velocity, and we subtract our lifetime. We set our opacity based on our lifetime. And then if we've run out of lifetime, we remove ourselves. And same as with the chest lid, if we hit something, we set our vertical velocity to 0, which means the coins can pop out and land on the chest and then slide off the chest and land on the ground and things like that. So how do we get from this one coin to like several? If I could click on things, that would be so cool. I love clicking on things. All right, so I'm going to delete that, and we're going to all right, so chest VFX, this template is doing a lot of the work here. So what this template has is it has a timeline spawner, and what this does is timeline spawner is a useful script that will let you spawn things on a timeline. So I've set these 1/10 of a second offset delays for all of the spawns, and then each spawn is just the chest coin. So every 1/10 of a second after this entity is spawned in, it will spawn a new coin until it's done, and it does 10 coins. This entity also has a particle system, which does kind of like the gold ring that comes out, and then it also plays a sound effect. And it has another particle system, which I don't remember. But anyway, so here's what this does. So it spawns some particles, and it spawns a bunch of coins, and the coins roll around as coins do, and it doesn't look half bad. So that's what that does. And so that's all there is for this. Not that much code, not that much effort, really. I don't know, this might have taken like a half hour or something, which I mean, like, less familiarity would take longer, right? But doing this kind of thing is not that scary once you just get into it and give it a shot. And I'll get off my soapbox. I'm going to take a quick water break, and then we'll come back for UI examples. All right, so this is the last round of examples I have for you guys today. I wanted to do a little bit with UI elements, because all of the stuff that I've kind of showcased today, you can relatively easily do with UI elements as well. Although with our current limited UI capabilities in TypeScript, you do have to do a little extra work to get things going. But so first example is just a common convention in games that have HUDs, heads-up displays, is whenever you're idle, they disappear. But so I made a little HUD that animates in and out, like so. So now it's on the screen, and if I walk away, there it goes. So what's important to note about this is the little animations are what make this work. You could just show the elements and then just hide them, and that would be sufficient. But having little animations can make it feel so much nicer, and they're not that hard to do, so why not? So none of these actually have much meaning, but so you've got three things. You've got foo, bar, and baz that just kind of slide in, and they, let's see, bar and foo I believe both use back easing, so they overshoot their target and then slide back to it, as you can see. There's a crosshair thing in the middle that's the elastic easing on the scale, so it kind of bounces in. It's like whoa, 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 like that. And then baz, I think in the bottom right corner, is doing exponential out. Yeah, that looks right. And then on the left we have an inventory of 4 items, and I put that there because there's only one UI timer for all of these elements, but they come in and out at different times, and the things in the inventory come in one after another, and it's very satisfying, in my opinion, how they animate in and out. So I'll show you guys how that's put together. So on this cube, we have one script called Hud, and what that one is doing is managing all of the state of everything. And then all of these other scripts, this HUD1 script, each one of these is one of those labels. And normally you would hard code some of this stuff, but I wanted to make one script that I could reuse for all of the HUD elements. So we have pause show, which is where it is on the screen when it's enabled. And then we have pause hide, which is where it is when it's not visible. We have a checkbox, so listen for. You can put a value in there, like a name for it to listen for. So the way this works is the HUD script, well, that'll be later, but it sends out events when UI values change, and then the UI scripts can listen for those events and say, oh, I'm the health bar, I'll change because it's the health value, things like that. So that's what listen for does. The do counter SFX, that'll come up later. Value prefix, that's if you want to, instead of just showing whatever the value is, maybe you want to put a $sign in front of it, or a plus or a minus, things like that, or a label of some kind. Start value is just what's in the text to begin with. Timer offset is a big one. Timer offset is what makes all the things staggered when they animate in and out. So the timer offset for foo here is 0, but then as we scroll down, the timer offset climbs up. So it looks like, which one is this? What's the starting value? Of course, all my properties are in random order because that's how it is. Oh, so okay, so this is the first inventory item. Its timer offset is 0, but then the subsequent one is negative 1/10 of a second. So that means 1/10 of a second after the first elements start, then that second inventory item comes in. And then down here, 2/10 after the rest start, that one starts, etc. And then after the inventory elements, we've got the, here's that center crosshair, so it has do scale turned on in here, as you can see. And then there's length show and length hide, which is how long the animation is to hide the element and how long the animation is to show the element, and then what its base size is for the text. And then you can type in which easing function you want for the ease show, the ease hide, and the ease scale. So it's elastic out for the crosshair, for the scale ease, and it does back in and back out for showing and hiding, but it doesn't actually move, so it doesn't really matter. Its position stays the same. But yeah, so you can see how all of these are put together. And we could look at scripts, although the script is a bit hairy because it's doing a bunch of stuff. But so this generic HUD element, that all of those are, it supports all these different things, and it's still about 200 lines of code, so that's not too bad, even though it is a little bit jank. Here's all those properties, and we have a bunch of timers and such. And let's see, I'm going to try to find. So I have several events in here that get called by the UI manager, which is this script over here. So we've got UI tick, which takes state and timer. State is either shown or hidden, and then the timer is just the internal timer that the UI system has. On this Hud script, it just manages its own timer and calls this function. On all the other UI scripts. But so if we're in an animation, then if we're shown, then we do the showing animation. If we're hidden, we do the hidden animation. And there's this little hack, this little get easing function, which just lets me get the right easing function from a string. So you can type in bounce.out and it'll go and grab the function. That's to make this property right here work, basically, and the other ones, this one and that one. And let's see. So there's UI tick, and then there is the UI state change. So whenever it goes from shown to hidden or from hidden to shown, we do an animation for that. And then UI update value, you'll see what that's for momentarily. But so here's our little HUD that boops in and out. We broke one of the things. Don't know how I broke it. Did it actually crash? I don't think so. Don't know what I did. Anyway, so here's another one of these, and this one, the values change. That's a little bit loud. So this one has a cash counter, an HP counter, and an ammo counter, and I'm in front of the ammo counter. But so this one, when the values change, they animate. So the inventory items just do a little wiggle. The HP changes color and does a wiggle, and it counts up and down when it changes. The money counts up and down and does a color based on the direction it's moving, and it plays a sound, as you can hear, which is a little bit grating, so I'm going to go ahead and mute this tab. But yeah, so none of this stuff is particularly hard to get going, and it's not super fancy as UIs go, but it's a little bit of polish that helps, and it's doable in our system as it currently is, and it adds some flavor that otherwise wouldn't be there. And I can give you a quick overview of how that stuff works. So the way that these are set up is all of these HUD scripts have a listen for. So the ammo one listens for ammo, and the cash one listens for money, and it has a $ prefix, and it does the counter, quote unquote. And the health one has the HP prefix, and so this one, it does color, and the color max value is 99, which is your max HP. So at max HP it's green, and at minimum HP it's red, and I'll show you how that works. So in here, this UI update value takes a name, a value, and the timer. So we check if the name matches the value we're listening for, and if it does, then we stringify it, and then we do some hacky stuff because of how I architected this. I wrote this in a real hurry. So if we're going to do the counter, we then re-extract a number out of the string that is the value. So I'll just, a moment of silence for my bad code. Anyway, so we do that. We set up the counter stuff if we're going to do the counter. If we're going to show what the max value is, like we do on the ammo, which is like whatever out of 200, we add that to the string here. If there's a prefix, we add that here. And then if the new value is already the value of the text, we just bail out instead of changing it. Otherwise, we compute what the new color would be if we're doing color. And then we set the timestamp when we change the value. And then up here in tick, in UI tick, what we do is we do some animation based on If we're not doing an animation, the like hide or show animation, then we go and check, are we doing a counter? If we're doing a counter, this is all the counter stuff. So we get what the value started at, and we lerp from that towards what it should be by the end, and then we see if we're at a new spot in that and we were last frame, and then if we are, we change the value, and then we also play the sound if there's the sound to play for the counter changing. If it's money in particular, I change the color here. And then we set the new text value on the label. And then if the animation is over, then we reset the color to default and we stop animating the counter. And then down here, if the value change timestamp has gone off, then we do the little wiggle that all of them do when their value changes. So let's go and look at where these get sent from. So over here in the Hud script, I have this table of random values for the different values I might listen for, because this is just for example purposes, and I don't have a real game providing real values for these things. And so in here, so we keep our timer. If the player's within range, then we're going to show or hide ourselves. Then we're going to send the UI tick function to this entity, so all of those HUD elements will get the UI tick event and they'll do their update. And then if we're going to send value updates, then we'll see if it's been, we wait a second between each value change, and then we just have like a shuffled list of the different things. So item 1 through 4, money, health, and ammo. We take one of those out of the bag, we send a new value for it. So the way that works is we send an event UI update value with the name of the thing, the new value to set, and what the current timer is. So that's what calls this UI update value on all the HUD scripts. And the ones that are listening for whatever one we picked will change their value. What else? Whenever our state changes, we send the UI state changed event out. And then this stuff here is just for whenever we run out of stuff in our bag of values to send, we fill up a new bag, basically. We just take all the things out of the table, put them in a list, shuffle the list, and then each time we want to change a value randomly, we take a thing out of the list and use it. And when the list is empty, we refill it. Anyway, so that is that, and that is the end of the examples that I have for you guys. Sorry this office hours has been like 2 weeks in the making. Just things have conspired to keep me otherwise occupied. If anybody has any questions about anything, please tag me on Discord, send me a DM, something, and I'll get to you as soon as I can. And I will get this edited and posted, and I'll provide links to all of the source materials that I showed and things like that. And if you want to look at any of these scripts, all of them have the same prefix. It's OH_10_01_2021, because that's when I started working on this office hours. And yeah, so all of the scripts for this office hours, the chest, the apples, all of the things, the doors, are all with that prefix, and you can check them out and adapt them for your own games. But thanks for watching my office hours this week. I hope everybody has a good one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.